Music. When the German Reich attacked the Soviet Union on the 22nd. When the German-Soviet War began on July 22, 1941, it became, alongside Italy, Hungary, Romania, and the Slovak state, involved in the far north. The front was supported by Finland's army under the leadership of the Finland-Swedish Field Marshal Baron Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim. But if you want to understand the reasons for Finland's involvement on the German side, you have to go back to the time before that, and you keep thinking of the saying that history does indeed repeat itself to this day. Despite the Finnish-Soviet non-aggression pact signed on January 21, 1932, the Soviet Union on the 30th November 1939 attacked its tiny neighbor Finland, which had a population of just 3.7 million, thus starting the so-called Winter War, which lasted until the 13th March 1940. Here is the situation on the 7th December. When the Red Army had reached the so-called Mannerheim Line, the Finnish defensive line between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland, stretching across the Karelian Isthmus. The reason for the Soviet aggression was territorial demands for the area in the Karelian Isthmus near Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, which Finland had rejected. Today, this view has become widely accepted, with the secret protocols of the pact named after Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, Red Circle, and his German counterpart Ribbentrop, Brown Circle, serving as evidence. The view is that Stalin intended, with his invasion, to conquer all of Finland and then install a Finnish communist puppet government, as had already been done from the 1st December 1939 in the conquered territories with the Democratic Republic of Finland, led by the Soviet-Finnish communist Otto Wilhelm Kuusinen, who is standing on the right in the picture. After the attack by the Red Army, here is a view of the front on the 12th. In December, there was the usual loud verbal outrage in the Western countries. Today, someone would probably call it a turning point. But this verbal outrage and the most generous promises of help soon turned out to be nothing but hot air, for the most part. Because the great hopes for military support from Western Europe, raised by the bravely resisting but small Finland, had, to put it politely, remained very modest. Only the neutral neighbor, the Kingdom of Sweden, had sent, in addition to 77,000 rifles, large quantities of ammunition and anti-aircraft guns, 8,000 volunteers to support the 250,000 Finnish soldiers with 32 tanks and 100 anti-tank guns, and 123 aircraft in their fight against the Red Army. Furthermore, volunteer contingents had been announced: 350 Hungarians, 1,000 Danes, 800 Norwegians, 230 Americans, and 150 Italians. However, they only arrived in Finland after the end of the war. France had sent 30 of its 1,000 Morane-Saulnier 406 fighter planes. Great Britain sent 30 outdated Gloucester Gladiator biplanes, and Italy sent 17 bombers of the Fiat BR 20 type. But if you compare all that with the 700,000 soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 3,000 aircraft that the Soviet Union deployed against Finland, then these Western deliveries were not even a drop in the bucket. However, the Western Allies, namely Great Britain and France, certainly had their reasons for continuing military activities in the north, because this allowed them to increase military pressure on their opponent, Germany. In addition, they had an undisguised desire for the possibility of cutting off the world's largest iron ore mine in Kiruna, northern Sweden, from the German supply routes. Thus, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and France's Foreign Minister Edouard Daladier promised the Finns an expeditionary corps of supposedly 100,000 soldiers to support their armed forces in February 1940. But what this corps was actually supposed to be used for was summed up at the time by the British General Henry Royds Pownall, then Director of Military Operations and Intelligence at the War Office. Of the 4 or 5 divisions that could have been sent across the North Sea, not a single division was intended for Finland. Maybe 1 or 2 brigades, if they were lucky. The rest were simply meant to occupy and hold the iron ore mines. It really is a most dishonest business. Shortly after this offer, the brave but outnumbered Finnish forces had to surrender. On March 13, 1940, the Finnish delegation signed the Moscow Peace Treaty, which ended the hostilities between the two states at 12 o'clock. Finland had to cede large parts of Karelia to the Soviet Union, including the entire isthmus and large areas north of Lake Ladoga. The ceded territories were significantly larger than those originally demanded by the Soviet Union before the war. So it was no wonder that the Finnish government under the jurist Risto Ryti from December 1, 1939 to December 1940. Prime Minister since the 19th. December 1940. Finnish President also kept in mind the unfulfilled promises of France and Great Britain to Czechoslovakia and Poland in their further political planning, had finally lost confidence in an intervention by the Western powers, and, after the capitulation, considered looking for a new partner, because it had once again become clear to the Finns that their small country was basically defenseless against the mighty neighbor, the Soviet Union, despite all the bravery of their soldiers. That the promises of the Western powers were not worth much, and that political cooperation with anti-communist Germany, which was militarily strong and successful in several campaigns, would probably be the most sensible option, which then led to Finland's participation in the German attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. However, President Ryti had made it clear to Berlin from the very beginning that their involvement in the war, unlike Germany's other allies, was purely defensive. It was merely the continuation of the Winter War of 1939-1940 with the goal of regaining the Finnish territories lost after the defeat in the Winter War in the Treaty of Moscow. Therefore, in his radio address on June 26, Ryti also referred to Finland's involvement as the Continuation War. But that was Marshal Mannerheim, who had been a lieutenant general in the Russian Tsarist army until the outbreak of the Russian October Revolution in 1917, and who had also commanded the Finnish army during the Winter War of 1939-1940. Had only accepted his government's request under one condition, that the Finnish armed forces would not be allowed to participate in a German attempt to capture Leningrad directly together with them, but would instead stop short of the city. With this, he wanted to avoid unnecessary provocations against the USSR. Since, as an old soldier, he was already 73 years old and had been a soldier since 1904, he could also assess how quickly the fortunes of war could change. He had also made his assessment known to President Risto Ryti. The Anglophile jurist Ryti, who was committed to the tradition of strong trade relations with Great Britain, was initially not a supporter of a political partnership with National Socialist Germany, since, as he explained, he had no illusions about the true nature of Germany. But after the campaign in Poland and the new German-Soviet border shown in red, the Baltic Sea was now dominated by the Germans and Soviets. But since Finland depended on important imports like food and fuel, he had approved the new connection, especially since Germany also promised reliable trade. In August 1940, He also agreed to a secret military cooperation with Germany. As it then became increasingly apparent in the major political constellation that the peace between Germany and the Soviet Union was not only fragile, but also that a war was becoming more and more likely, Ruthie had now gradually initiated a policy aimed at securing Finnish claims, even to territories he considered to be in the country's interest, in case the great reorganization of Eastern European territory should also come about through war. For example, the Continuation War would also include the occupation of East Karelia, for which nationalist circles had been fighting since the 1910s. Ruthie's ideas of territorial expansion were also supported by the opinion held by Western military experts that the Soviet army, the Colossus with feet of clay, would collapse within a few weeks in the event of a German invasion. But when Germany actually attacked the Soviet Union on June 22, June 1941 began, Finland initially remained militarily neutral until the 25th. June, when the bombing of Finnish cities by the Soviet Air Force led to a declaration of war on the Soviet Union, and German units were given permission to now launch offensives from Finland as well. Here is the deployment of the forces stationed at the Finnish-Soviet border from the beginning of Barbarossa, then from July 31 to the 5th. In September, the Finnish army attacked in two phases north and east of Lake Ladoga, capturing on the 29th August, recapturing the province of Karelia with its capital Vyborg, which had been lost after the defeat in the Winter War of 1940. Here is the victory parade afterwards. But the demand of the chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, to Mannerheim in September, that the Finnish army should now continue to advance, and to join up there with the advancing German forces along the southern coast of Lake Ladoga, both Mannerheim and President Ryti had rejected this. After the Finnish army had reached the objectives set for them on December 6, they switched to a defensive stance. Positional warfare now began, which led to a long period of relative calm at the front until June 1944. But as for the independent stance shown outwardly towards Germany, both by Mannerheim and by Ryti, here in June 1942, during Hitler's visit on the occasion of the 75th birthday of the Marshal, both were quite aware of their own weakness, because their country, a third of which lies north of the Arctic Circle, was heavily dependent on German food and fuel supplies. This dependence became even greater after Finland's important pre-war trading partner, Great Britain, under its Prime Minister Winston Churchill, gave in to Soviet pressure and, on the 6th of December 1941, declared war on Finland. London had chosen the Finnish Independence Day for this, the very day when Marshal Mannerheim had given orders to the Finnish army, immediately after the capture of the Karelian city of Metsvitshigagorsk, to halt all further attacks on all fronts and switch to defense. Parallel to the British declaration of war on Finland on the 6th. On December 6th, parallel to the British declaration of war on Finland, and most likely coordinated with the British, Marshal of the Red Army, Georgy Zhukov, launched the Red Army's counteroffensive against the 68 exhausted German divisions positioned before Moscow, using 106 division-sized formations at divisional strength, including 21 fresh elite divisions from Siberia, which led to the Wehrmacht's defeat before Moscow. What was remarkable about this major offensive on December 6th was that on the 5th, there was a situation assessment by the OKW Intelligence Division Foreign Armies East, under Colonel Eberhard Kinzel, that the Soviet troops were currently not capable of launching a major attack in the sector of Army Group Center without receiving significant reinforcements. And to make matters worse, the Japanese attack on the Pacific Fleet stationed at the Hawaiian naval base Pearl Harbor, took place 1 day later, on the 7th, had now officially brought the USA into the war as well. Now, after the first defeat of the German Wehrmacht, which until then had been considered invincible, the Finnish authorities realized that the German hope for a blitzkrieg against the Soviet Union was finally off the table, and that they would now have to prepare for a longer war. However, Finland's limited resources would not be sufficient for this, which had become even more acute over the course of 1942 and especially after the dramatic German catastrophe at Stalingrad. This meant that on the day of the 6th Army's surrender, Army by the commander, Colonel General Friedrich Paulus, on the 3rd February 1943, and 4 days after the end of the fighting that lasted until the 30th of January, after the Red Army's attempt in Operation Spark during the Second Battle of Lake Ladoga to break the German siege ring around Leningrad, President Ryti and other cabinet members met with Marshal Mannerheim, quote, to discuss the general situation. After the meeting, they all agreed that Finland needed to find a way out of the war, but due to its economic dependence on Germany, it could not do so immediately, and especially not openly. Just under a week later, on February 9th, Mannerheim's intelligence chief, Colonel Aladar Parsonen, delivered a classified speech at a closed session of Parliament, and he ended with the advice to the members of Parliament to get used to the possibility that we would once again be forced to sign a peace treaty with Moscow. But before any further confidential steps could be taken, on the 15th February, the opposition Social Democratic Party under Väinö Salovaara stabbed the government in the back and made a public statement that Finland had the right to withdraw from the war if it considered this desirable and possible, brought this politically explosive issue into the open. This publication of a secret Finnish domestic political process was promptly exploited by the United States of America, which was allied with the Soviet Union through its embassy in Helsinki with a so-called mediation offer. After that, Finland's Foreign Minister Henrik Ramsay, about whom the otherwise very Finland-friendly German liaison officer, General of the Infantry Waldemar Erfurt, here with Marshal Mannerheim, had complained that the foreign minister had poor relations with Germany, flew to Berlin to inform them about the American offer. Ramsay had also tried to get a commitment from the German foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop that the Wehrmacht would voluntarily withdraw from northern Finland if Finland were to request it. Ribbentrop's response: Finland should not only reject the American approach, but also commit to Berlin that it would not agree to an armistice without German approval. To conclude one with Moscow. After Hitler had already received the leaders of Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia at the Berghof, essentially to keep them on side, Berlin's ambassador to Finland, Vipert von Blücher, seen on the right in the picture with a Finnish officer, on February 15, 1943, he asked the newly re-elected President Ryti to now also travel to Germany. But when Ryti, marked with the blue circle to Berlin's annoyance, refused, Blücher, marked with the brown circle, was temporarily recalled. And, to underline their annoyance, from the beginning of June, all food deliveries to Finland were stopped, and the supply of fuel and lubricants was halved. However, since Germany could not risk angering its only ally with proven ability to successfully fight the Red Army, the restrictions were lifted again at the end of June. And this, even though Finland had made no concessions. Until at least the end of 1942, most of Finland's political and military leaders did not want to believe that Germany could lose the war. Only Mannheim had recognized this possibility earlier, with the consequence that the Finnish army had not undertaken any offensives of its own during all those years. Since 1942, The Finnish government had also regularly surveyed public opinion through polls. One question had been important. Do you believe that Germany will win? But in September 1942, 90 to 95% of conservatives, 55% of social democrats, and even 70% of communists still believed in a German victory. In January 1943, as a reaction to the German defeat at Stalingrad and the Second Battle of Lake Ladoga that had taken place near Finland, the numbers had changed. Only 40 to 45% among conservatives, 19% among social democrats, and 14% among communists. Now, the brave but hopelessly outmatched Finland began, without Berlin's knowledge, to explore the possibilities for negotiations to find a way out of the war. In July, the Soviet embassy in Stockholm, led by Alexandra Mikhailovna Kollontai, had a message delivered to Helsinki through the Belgian ambassador, expressing their willingness to negotiate, provided that the initiative came from the Finnish side. However, for the Finnish leadership, who still considered Germany their most militarily competent and reliable ally, this was not an option at that time. Instead, they had made a proposal to the United States, which had not yet declared war on them in the summer, born out of necessity, to persuade them to militarily occupy Finland, which would be far better for them than a German or, in the end, a Soviet occupation. Through the U.S. Embassy in Lisbon, the U.S. State Department was informed that if American forces were to land in northern Norway and then march into Finland from there, the Finnish army would not offer any resistance. However, the U.S. government under Franklin D. Roosevelt, who felt great sympathy for Joe Stalin, showed no interest in Finland's proposal and missed this unique opportunity. So Finland remained on Germany's side until September 1944. But the fact that its leaders since the 2nd February 1943, the day of the German capitulation at Stalingrad, had begun to look for a way out for their country, also showed political foresight and responsibility. We are moving into the year 1944. After Army Group Center, starting on the 22nd, in June, with the Soviet Operation Bagration, which I have 2 videos about, facing its complete destruction, the Red Army began the Vyborg-Petrozavodsk operation on the 25th June, which lasted until the 9th July, in the Battle of Tali-Ihantala, which lasted until then, launched a major offensive on the Karelian Isthmus with triple superiority, which broke through the next day. It had been carried through the Finnish line shown in blue and could only be stopped at the VVT line shown in red. In view of the impending military catastrophe, Ryti was on the 1st August 1944 resigned and handed over the government office to Marshal Mannerheim. Here is his swearing in. He then intensified the peace negotiations with the Soviet Union, which were already underway through Swedish mediation, but at the same time ordered the Finnish units, whose only armored division was mainly equipped with German Sturmgeschütz III assault guns, to begin a delaying action against the Soviet army. The Finns were supported by the German Assault Gun Brigade 303, and Captain Hans Wilhelm Cardenio with 27 Sturmgeschütz, 3 and 9 assault howitzers, 42. And the Luftwaffe Combat Group Kulme, named after its leader, Lieutenant Colonel Kurt Kulme, with about 60 to 70 Stukas Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt fighter planes. Then, by July 9th, and with heavy losses, the 4th Finnish Army Corps, under the bearer of the Mannerheim Cross and the German Cross in gold, Lieutenant General Taavetti Latikainen, stopped the Soviet advance. However, by then, the overall successes of the Red Army on all fronts were so overwhelming that the Finnish government, once again fearing a Soviet occupation, on the 2nd of September, decided to surrender. 2 days later, on the 4th, the Finnish army declared the cessation of its fighting. Then, on the 19th of September 1944, representatives of Finland and those of the USSR and Great Britain, on behalf of the countries at war with Finland, signed the Moscow Armistice Agreement, which officially ended the continuation war. In addition to confirming the territorial losses from the Winter War, the Petsamo region had to be ceded, but at least the Finns were able to maintain their independence. Although documents found later proved that Stalin actually wanted to incorporate all of Finland into the Soviet Union, and he only refrained from doing so while the main opponent, Germany, had not yet been defeated. The price for independence had been the demands that Finland had to end diplomatic relations with Germany, and that all now non-allied German soldiers who did not leave the country by the 15th of September 1944 had to be expelled, interned, or disarmed. This task had fallen to the 3rd Army Corps under Lieutenant General Hjalmar Siilasvuo, which consisted of the 3rd, 6th, and 11th Division, the Panzer Division, as well as Infantry Regiment 15 and the Border Ranger Regiment, with a total strength of around 75,000 men. However, the Finnish demand was to have their land back by the 15th. Leaving by September 15th was completely unrealistic, since, for example, the German units shown in blue, which had so far defended central Finland, had been stationed about 400 kilometers from the ports shown in red on the green-bordered Gulf of Bothnia and over 600 kilometers from the Finnish-Norwegian border. Even without enemy interference, the marching time to the Gulf of Bothnia would have taken at least 30 days. The large German unit that the 3rd Finnish Corps was supposed to disarm or drive out was the 20th, with around 215,000 soldiers. Mountain Army, led by Colonel General Dr. Yuri Lothar Rendulic. At that time, the army had 32,000 horses or mules and over 20,000 vehicles, as well as food, ammunition, and fuel for 6 months, and was organized into the 19th Mountain Corps under General of Mountain Troops Ferdinand Jodl, with the 2nd and 6th Mountain Division, as well as the local Coastal Defense Division 210 in the operational area of the far north of the Petsamo region next to the Arctic Ocean. The 36th Mountain Corps under General of the Mountain Troops Emil Vogel, with the 163rd and 169th Infantry Divisions, the Norway Tank Brigade, and the MG Ski Brigade Finland. Area of operations: the greater region of Sala and Alakurti in East Lapland. And the 18th Mountain Corps under General of the Infantry Friedrich Hochbaum, with the 7th Mountain Division, the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord, and Division ZBV 140, responsible for the southern flank at Kastenga and Utua. As for the capitulation of Finland, it did not come as a surprise to the German troops. Months earlier, preparations had already been made under the codename Berka for a possible evacuation of the German troops to the occupied neighboring country of Norway, under the cover of being sent to Utua. The withdrawal movements are marked in blue, because neither the Wehrmacht nor their until then loyal and reliable brother-in-arms Finland had much desire to fight each other. Therefore, after September 19, something like a phony war developed, which the Finnish Quartermaster General, Lieutenant General Axel Iro, had referred to as autumn maneuvers. In this phony war, the Finns and Germans repeatedly made secret agreements, such as the avoidance of retreat routes and the destruction of bridges by the Wehrmacht. Part of this tactic was to provide the Soviets with verifiable evidence that a rapid pursuit by the Finns would not have been possible. However, this Finnish-German phony war did not go unnoticed by the Allied Control Commission, which was supposed to monitor compliance with the Moscow Armistice. As a result, Moscow had threatened to occupy Finland after all, if they did not finally begin to expel or disarm the Germans. Under this pressure, Lieutenant General Sielisvuo had no choice but to use his troops more actively against the Wehrmacht. Meanwhile, the aforementioned German Operation Burke had also begun, whose main task was to protect the then vital nickel mining in Petsamo, from which Germany obtained 73% of its nickel. Burke also had several phases. The first phase, the removal of all equipment and materials, was triggered by the encrypted order Initiate Burke. The second phase, which was triggered by Burke-Felon, involved the actual military withdrawal to the Sturmbach defensive positions that had been completed between 1942 and September 1944. Here is the modern view of the area. The plan was to render the infrastructure unusable during the retreat, just as you can see in the picture, the Finnish forces had already done during their retreat in the summer of 1944. In the final phase of Operation Burka, the remaining German units were supposed to retreat to the positions at the capital of Lapland, Rovaniemi, which also served as the headquarters of the 20th. It had housed both the headquarters of the 20th Mountain Army and an airfield of the 5th Air Fleet. However, despite the best preparations, carrying out Operation Burke initially proved to be difficult. The reasons included, among other things, the lack of shipping space and the country's inadequate road and path network, and finally, the uncertainty about how the Soviet forces, and especially the former ally Finland, would behave. After the Wehrmacht had already started transporting surplus equipment and personal belongings to Germany in July 1944, September, the actual Operation Burka began with the withdrawal of the army and all its equipment. The withdrawal movements of the German units, including from Soviet territory, began in a hurried operation on the night of September 9th. In the process, except for the southern part of the German front in the area commanded by General Hochbaum, the 18th Mountain Corps, where there had been no fighting, the remaining units were constantly engaged in battles with Soviet troops. On both sides of the retreat roads, hastily dug graves for the fallen German soldiers had been made again and again. The soldiers were only relatively safe once they had reached Finnish territory, because at the border the Red Army had stopped its pursuit and halted. The first clashes between German and Finnish soldiers occurred on the 28th September 1944 around 8 o'clock in the morning, in the so-called Battle of Olhava. There, the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord, under SS Gruppenführer and Lieutenant General of Police Karl Heinrich Brenner, and the SS Mountain Reconnaissance Battalion 6, under SS Obersturmführer Alfred Zimmermann, were present. On their retreat at the 45-meter-long railway and road bridge between Oulu and Hetekile, they encountered two motorized Finnish Jaeger battalions with assault guns, anti-aircraft cannons, and tanks, with whom they had already exchanged fire the previous day in the area of the city of Pudasjärvi. Allegedly, the soldiers were supposed to smoke cigarettes first. However, the orders of both units had been quite different. The Finns' order: attack the Germans the next morning and next to the bridge. The Germans: demolition of the bridge. But when the Finns, still on the 28th, tried to remove the explosive charges from the bridge, the soldiers of the reconnaissance unit had detonated the charges, after which a firefight broke out, resulting in 5 Finns and 2 Germans falling victim, the first casualties of the Lapland War. The firefight lasted just under half an hour. Then the reconnaissance unit withdrew to the north. A memorial stone commemorates this event today. Further Finnish attacks targeted the supply base of the 20th Mountain Army on the Gulf of Bothnia, with which the Finns, among other things, wanted to cut off the German retreat to the north. When the Finnish attacks reached a scale that, in addition to the delays at the bridges, led to ever higher losses for the Wehrmacht on the 4th. It was decided in Berlin on October 4th to finally abandon the Lapland front and switch from Operation Bridge to Operation Northern Lights. Northern Lights applied to the retreat of the 20th Mountain Army from the Petsamo front to northern Norway at the Lyngenfjord from the end of 1944 to the beginning of 1945. In Finnmark, the most sparsely populated Norwegian district with only 1.5 inhabitants per square kilometer, around 50,000 people, had been evacuated ahead of the Soviet troops following the Wehrmacht, and to slow down their advance, around 11,000 houses and 350 bridges were rendered unusable, like here near Kirkenes, as done by the 20th. As expected by the 20th Mountain Army on the 7th October 1944, the Soviet Petsamo-Kirkenes operation against the Murmansk front began, in which the Red Army, marked with red arrows, with around 113,000 soldiers, 110 tanks, and 2,100 guns, attacked the 19th marked with blue arrows. Mountain Corps of General Jodl, with a total strength of 45,000 men and about 145 guns. The 19th Corps had under its command the 2nd, which defended the left flank, Mountain Division under Lieutenant General Hans Degen, and the 6th, which was positioned on the right flank, Mountain Division under Lieutenant General Max Joseph Pemsel, who later also served as Lieutenant General of the Bundeswehr's 2nd Corps in Ulm. The subordinate Grenadier Brigade 388, under Colonel Gustav Adolf Mehle, stationed at the important supply hub Petsamo, and the locally based Coastal Defense Division 210, under Lieutenant General Cord Ebeling, stationed instead of Kirkenes, the divisional group Van der Hoop with Grenadier Regiments 103 and 503 under the commander of the so-called Fortress of Petsamo, Colonel, later, from January, Major General Adrian van der Hoop. However, his divisional group only had the strength of a regiment. Just like the Bicycle Reconnaissance Brigade Norway, under Lieutenant Colonel Dietrich Freier von Berlichingen-Jagdhausen since January 20th. As of April 1945, Colonel, also with a strength of only 1,667 men. With the Soviet operation, the 20th Mountain Army was now forced to fight on 3 fronts, in the west and south against the Finns, and on the Moman front against the Russians. But at the latest, with the arrival of the German units on Finnish-Norwegian territory, the Red Army had halted its further advance. However, the German soldiers, under the highest orders, and also believing that their Finnish comrades in arms had practically betrayed them, not infrequently used the scorched earth tactic during their retreats, which, by the way, could be observed in almost all previous and subsequent wars, and with all armies, and can still be seen today, including in the current war in Ukraine. Even the capital of Lapland, Rovaniemi, fell victim to the flames. Rovaniemi, where 90% of the buildings had been destroyed, is often mentioned in literature and on the internet as the example of scorched earth. However, by now, the cause of the massive damage in this city should probably be viewed in a more nuanced way. Thus, during the German retreat between the 14th and 16th, it is said that the Battle of Rovaniemi, which took place from October 14th to 16th, 1944, involved about 1,500 Finns from the Jaeger Brigade with Jaeger Battalions 2, 3, and 5. With 20 tanks and a rear guard of about 500 soldiers supported by 3 tanks, belonging to the 6th Mountain Division North, part of the SS Mountain Infantry Regiment. 12 the following events took place. On the 13th, the German unit had begun to destroy all empty or public buildings in the city, including the so-called Wehrmacht House of Comradeship, while hospitals, churches, and inhabited houses were supposed to be spared. After the first public buildings had been set on fire, The commander of the regiment, SS Standartenführer Franz Schreiber, gave the order to pull a munitions train standing at the Rovaniemi station, without a locomotive, loaded with 400 tons of artillery and mortar shells, rifles, machine gun ammunition, and mines, out of the city using a tank. But for some inexplicable reason, the munitions train was back at the station in the evening, and to this day, the cause for this has not been clarified. Either it had been pushed back there, or it had rolled back on its own, or it had not been moved at all. In the evening, also for unexplained reasons, the train caught fire along the tracks, and the ammunition exploded. Then, the shells and burning debris that rained down on the city for hours set numerous wooden houses on fire. Later, a Finnish commando unit is said to have admitted that they blew up the ammunition train, which may have been the main cause of the city's destruction. But as I said, to this day, no one can say what circumstances really led to the destruction of the now rebuilt city of Rovaniemi. In the battle, 36 Finnish soldiers and 52 German soldiers were killed. They rest together with the other 2,478 German soldiers who fell in Lapland during the entire Second World War at the German military cemetery of Norvajärvi, which is located 18 kilometers from Rovaniemi. 690 of the soldiers could not be identified. Despite these rather isolated Finnish attacks, the Lapland War, the battle under the Northern Lights, was effectively over by early November 1944. The Wehrmacht had continued to retreat relatively unimpeded. The Finnish Jaeger Brigade had been demobilized down to 600 men by February 1945. Then, after a final skirmish with Finnish soldiers, on April 25, 1945, the last German units had left Finnish soil at Kilpisjärvi, located in the far northwest, and had crossed the border into Norway. Here, on April 27, Finnish soldiers celebrate this event with a flag-raising ceremony at the tri-point of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. With that, the Lapland War, which lasted from September 19, 1944 to April 27, 1945, was over. It had lasted 7 months, 1 week, and 1 day. But in contrast to other armed conflicts of World War II, its casualties were relatively limited. Among the Finns, 774 soldiers were killed, 262 were missing, and 2,904 were wounded. The Wehrmacht had around 1,000 dead and 2,000 wounded. 1,300 of their soldiers had been taken prisoner of war and, according to the terms of the Armistice, had been handed over to the USSR as prisoners of war. In retrospect, the following can be stated. For the population of Lapland, the destruction during the Lapland War, and the feeling of having been abandoned by their own government, which had deliberately accepted the Lapland War to save the rest of Finland from Soviet occupation, caused lasting trauma. For Germany, the rift had no political significance at the latest after the unconditional surrender of the Wehrmacht in May 1945. However, in Finland, young women who had been involved with a German occupation soldier and perhaps even had a child together had to pay for decades as Nazi whores, along with their little children. In this, the Communist Party of Finland, which was readmitted in 1944, had stood out disgracefully for its hatred. Today, however, relations between Germany and Finland are once again especially friendly and close. Bundeswehr soldiers train with their Finnish comrades in Lapland, and every year, on Finland Day in Hohenlockstedt, Schleswig-Holstein, German and Finnish soldiers commemorate the Finnish Jaegers, who were formed in 1916 from volunteers of the Grand Duchy of Finland and served on the Eastern Front on the German side during World War I as part of the Royal Prussian Jaeger Battalion, number 27.